At the windswept edge of the Roman world, where civilization met the unknown, Rome drew a line in stone and dared the world to cross it. That line was Hadrian's Wall. Stretching 73 miles across the wilds of northern Britannia, it was more than just a wall. It was a statement, a warning. A frontier packed with soldiers, watchtowers, and fortresses designed not just to keep invaders out, but to project Roman power into the most remote corner of the empire. And remarkably, many of the forts along Hadrian's Wall, places like Housesteads, Vindolanda, and Chesters, stood for centuries without ever being breached in open battle. They were outposts of order in a land of chaos. Garrison towns built with stone and discipline, holding back waves of raiders, rebels, and the relentless force of nature. Life there was harsh, cold, and isolated, but these forts endured longer than the empire itself. This is the story of the Roman frontier. How a wall became a world, how its forts never fell, and how Rome held the line where the map once ended. Because sometimes the greatest victories aren't won in conquest, but in holding the ground no one else could. Welcome to the Roman Empire. When the Romans first arrived in Britain in 43 AD, they came to conquer. But by the time Emperor Hadrian took the throne in 117 AD, the empire had stretched itself to the breaking point. It was vast, costly, and under constant pressure from the peoples beyond its borders. So Hadrian changed strategy. Instead of expanding endlessly, he ordered consolidation. And in Britain, that meant building a wall, a physical and psychological barrier to mark the edge of Roman power. The goal wasn't just to stop every raider or rebel, it was to control movement, enforce taxation, and keep the peace through strength. Construction began around 122 AD. The result was one of the most ambitious engineering projects in Roman history, Hadrian's Wall. Spanning nearly 80 Roman miles from coast to coast, the wall was made of stone in the east and turf in the west, following the contours of the rugged northern landscape. But this wasn't just a wall. Every Roman mile, roughly 1500 meters, featured a small fortlet called a mile castle. Between these were turrets and every few miles massive auxiliary forts, military garrisons capable of housing hundreds of soldiers. The wall didn't stop every attack, but it certainly slowed them, contained them, and ensured that Roman control didn't vanish once you left the cities of the south. It was a hard line between the Roman world and the tribes beyond. A line guarded by forts that would become some of the most resilient outposts in Roman history. Life along Hadrian's Wall wasn't glamorous, it was grit, discipline, and duty. Each major fort along the wall, like Housesteads, Vindolanda, Birdserwalds, and Chesters, was a self-contained world. These weren't just military outposts, they were miniature towns complete with barracks, granaries, workshops, bathhouses, and even temples. At their peak, each fortress housed between 500 and 1,000 soldiers, most of them not Roman citizens, but auxiliaries recruited from the far corners of the empire. Syrians, Spaniards, Thracians, and Gauls, all living and fighting on the cold frontier of Britannia. Discipline was strict and patrols were constant. Soldiers rotated between guarding the wall, training, and maintaining the infrastructure of the fort. Each unit had its own commander, administrative offices, and a religious shrine dedicated to the emperor's genius, a reminder that even all the way out there, they still served the will of Rome. Behind the forts, vice settlements sprang up. Civilian towns filled with traders, families, and local Britons who lived off the Roman presence. Despite official bans, many soldiers took local partners and raised children. Roman and native cultures blended in messy human ways, visible in everything from pottery styles to religion. And although the terrain was harsh and the winters brutal, the forts endured. Supplies flowed up from the south, roads were maintained, orders were issued from imperial governors and enforced with brutal efficiency. Over centuries of service, none of these major forts were ever taken by force. Raiders came, revolts flared, but the walls and the men held. The Roman grip on northern Britain, at least for a time, remained unbroken. To the Romans, the land beyond Hadrian's Wall was Barbaricum, the untamed world. forested hills, stormy skies, and tribes who answered to no emperor. The most notorious of these were the Picts, fierce, elusive warriors from what is now Scotland. They weren't a single nation, but a patchwork of clans and confederations. They raided, vanished into the wilds, and struck again. And they weren't alone. The Meatai, Caledonians, and other northern tribes all resisted Roman control, sometimes with small ambushes, and other times with full-scale invasions. But the genius of Hadrian's Wall wasn't that it stopped them all, it slowed them, watched them, and wore them down. The fortresses along the wall created a defensive chain. If a raid breached one section, signal fires alerted others. Reinforcements could be dispatched quickly. Roman cavalry patrols scouted the northern countryside and, in some cases, crossed the wall to launch preemptive strikes. The wall was also a psychological weapon. You see, it wasn't just a barrier, it was a message. This far and no farther. The stone, the order, the discipline, it reminded every tribe looking south that they were staring at the edge of a superpower. And yet, despite centuries of tension, none of the major Roman forts along Hadrian's Wall, Housesteads, Chesters, Vindolanda, Burdiswald, were ever successfully stormed or captured by native forces. Now, they were isolated, surrounded, and occasionally under siege, but they were never breached. Rome had plenty of failures elsewhere in the empire, but here on the ragged edge of the known world, its military systems worked. And they continued to work for nearly 300 years. Hadrian's Wall was never meant to last forever. And by the 4th century AD, the cracks had begun to show, not in the stone, but in the empire itself. Rome was overstretched, civil wars tore through the provinces, and emperors came and went in a blur. The legions, once the unshakable force behind the wall, were being called away to fight more urgent battles on the Rhine, the Danube, and even in Italy itself. The final blow came in the early 5th century when Roman control over Britain collapsed altogether. The legions were recalled to defend Rome itself, and the frontier was left to fend for itself. The forts were abandoned, some slowly, others overnight. Soldiers vanished, trade routes dried up, the Great Wall of the North was left to the wind and the rain. They were, however, never taken. Housesteads was not stormed, Vindolanda was not burned, Chesters didn't fall to a horde of raiders. These outposts, isolated, undermanned, and deep in enemy territory, held their ground until the very end. Not because they were invincible, but because the system they were part of, Rome's roads, logistics, architecture, and discipline, just worked. And when Rome left, the world around the wall changed. Locals moved in, stones were scavenged, pagan temples were replaced by Christian chapels, eventually the wall faded into legend. But the ruins remain. Today, you can still walk the foundations of these forts. You can stand in the granaries that once fed soldiers, in barracks where auxiliaries from Syria or Gaul slept. You can touch the frontier Rome once drew, and even feel the weight of what it meant. For nearly 300 years, the forts along Hadrian's Wall stood firm, unbroken, unbreached, and unyielding. They were never grand imperial capitals. They didn't host Caesars or Senate debates. But they held the line day after day, year after year, in wind, rain, snow, and silence. In the end, Rome didn't lose these forts to war. It outlived them. When the empire collapsed in the west, the soldiers didn't fall in battle, they simply left, and the wall, like Rome itself, slipped into legend. But even today, their story still stands, carved in stone, scattered across the wild hills of northern England. A reminder that empires don't always fall in fire and ruin. Sometimes they end with walls still standing. Rome may have faded, but it never gave up the wall. Thank you so much for watching this episode of the Roman Empire. If you enjoyed this video, then please consider subscribing to us, as it'll help us out and we do really appreciate seeing all of the support. So until next time, I hope everyone has an amazing week. Cheers!